She was 19 when the wedding day arrived, though it felt less like a beginning and more like an ending she had never chosen. From the moment she woke before dawn, her chest felt tight as if the air itself refused to move freely around her. The house was full of women voices, laughter, instructions, yet none of it reached her heart. They dressed her carefully, adjusting fabric and jewelry, speaking of honor and duty as if those words were gifts meant to comfort her. She stared at her reflection, barely recognizing the girl looking back. Her eyes held fear, not excitement, and her hands trembled no matter how tightly she folded them together. This marriage had been decided long before she was asked, and her silence had been mistaken for consent. In her town, tradition spoke louder than youth, louder than dreams, louder than fear. As the sun rose, music filled the streets and neighbors gathered smiling proudly. They saw a celebration, a proper union, a future secured. She saw a door closing with every step toward the ceremony. Her thoughts raced through everything she was leaving behind: her childhood, her freedom, her voice. She barely knew the man she was being given to, only the stories whispered behind doors and exchanged in lowered tones. He was said to be strict, distant, unforgiving, a man who did not smile easily, a man who believed obedience was love. Those rumors had taken root in her mind, growing stronger with every fearful thought. When she finally stood beside him, she could not bring herself to look up fully. She sensed his presence, solid, unmoving, like a shadow cast too close. He did not speak to her then, and the silence felt heavy, almost frightening. The vows were recited, words about loyalty and honor and lifetime bonds, but they felt hollow to her, like promises made without her permission. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure others could hear it, yet no one noticed. They were too busy celebrating a union that made sense to them. Inside, she felt small and trapped, like a bird with clipped wings forced into a cage decorated with flowers. She wondered if this fear would become her daily companion, if she would learn to live with it quietly the way women before her had done. She had been taught endurance, not choice, patience, not protest. As the ceremony ended and applause rose around her, she felt tears burn behind her eyes, but she did not let them fall. Crying would be seen as weakness, and weakness was not forgiven here. This was how her marriage began, not with love or hope but with fear and resignation. She stood there surrounded by people, yet completely alone, believing her future had already been written and that whatever waited for her beyond this day would require silence, strength, and survival rather than happiness. Fear followed her into marriage like a shadow that refused to loosen its grip. In the days after the wedding, she moved through her new home quietly, careful with every step, every breath, every glance. The house felt unfamiliar and heavy, filled with unspoken rules she did not yet understand. She listened more than she spoke and watched more than she acted, believing that silence was the safest language she could use. Each morning she woke with her heart already tight, bracing herself for a life she believed would demand obedience above all else. The fear did not come only from him but from everything she had heard before the wedding. The town had shaped her expectations long before she crossed the threshold. Women whispered warnings disguised as advice. Men spoke of him with respect edged by distance. Children grew quiet when his name was mentioned. None of them spoke of cruelty openly, yet none spoke of warmth either. From those silences she learned to be afraid. She told herself that survival meant learning his moods, anticipating his needs, and never challenging his authority. She believed love was not something she had been promised, only duty. Her thoughts circled endlessly around what kind of wife she was expected to be: quiet, grateful, compliant. She questioned her worth, wondering if fear was simply the price she had to pay for stability and acceptance. In her mind she prepared herself for years of restraint, teaching her heart to stay guarded, teaching her dreams to remain small. Each interaction with her husband felt like walking across thin ice. He was reserved, his words measured, his presence commanding without effort. He did not raise his voice or show anger, yet that restraint frightened her even more. She searched his expressions for signs of threat or kindness, unsure which would come first. When he spoke, she listened carefully, afraid that one wrong response could change everything. At night she lay awake, staring into darkness, replaying every moment of the day, judging her actions, questioning whether she had done enough to avoid displeasure. She missed the girl she had been before marriage, the one who laughed freely, who imagined love as something gentle and chosen. That girl felt very far away now, replaced by someone cautious and unsure. Around her the town watched quietly, waiting for her to settle into a role. They believed fear was normal, that adjustment required sacrifice. No one asked how she felt or what she wanted. Their silence reinforced her belief that endurance was her destiny and that speaking out would only bring shame. Yet beneath the fear there was something fragile and stubborn that refused to disappear. A small part of her still hoped that the rumors were wrong, that the man beside her was more than the stories that defined him. She did not trust that hope, yet she carried it quietly, hidden deep within herself, afraid to let it grow but unable to let it die. As the days passed she began to notice small things that did not fit the stories she had been told. He did not bark orders or demand her attention. He gave her space, moving through the house with a careful distance, as if he were the guest rather than the master. This unsettled her more than harshness would have, because she did not know how to prepare for kindness when she had trained herself only for fear. She watched him closely, learning his routines, his silences, his pauses. He rose early and worked until evening, yet never questioned how she spent her hours when their paths crossed. His gaze was steady but not cruel, and when he spoke his voice carried restraint rather than command. She waited constantly for the moment when the mask would fall, when the man from the rumors would finally appear. Instead she saw restraint that looked almost like patience. He asked if she needed anything but did not insist on an answer. He left food for her when she ate late. He knocked before entering rooms that were now considered hers. These gestures were small, yet they unsettled the world she had built in her mind because they did not match the life she had prepared herself to endure. Still, she did not allow herself to trust what she saw. Fear had taught her that gentleness could be temporary and that hope was dangerous. She reminded herself that appearances could deceive and that power often revealed itself slowly. She remained cautious, her words few, her emotions hidden behind practiced stillness. At times she caught him watching her with an expression she could not name, not hunger, not anger, but something closer to concern or conflict. It made her uneasy because it suggested that he too was aware of the weight between them. She wondered whether he had wanted this marriage or whether it had been decided for him as well. This thought unsettled her deeply because it opened a door she had kept locked. If he was not her enemy, then who was? If fear had been planted by others rather than grown from truth, then what had she been protecting herself from? She did not yet have the courage to explore those questions, but they lingered quietly, reshaping her understanding of the man she had been taught to fear. By the end of this part, the certainty she once clung to had begun to crack. She was no longer sure that her marriage was a prison or that her husband was the villain of her story. She was standing at the edge of an unfamiliar truth, one that frightened her in a different way because it carried the risk of hope. The wedding gift was presented not in private but before the entire town, when expectations were heavy and tradition ruled every movement. People gathered believing they were about to witness something predictable, perhaps land, perhaps gold, perhaps a gesture of ownership. She stood beside him with her hands folded, her heart racing, prepared for anything except surprise. He stepped forward calmly and spoke in a steady voice that carried across the crowd. He said the gift was not something that could be wrapped or displayed, but something that had meaning beyond ceremony. Then he did something no one expected. He announced that she would not be bound by obedience but by choice, that she would have the right to speak, to decide, to leave the house freely, to continue her education if she wished, and to shape her own life within or beyond the marriage. A murmur rippled through the crowd, disbelief spreading across familiar faces. She felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Her breath caught as his words reached her, not as promises whispered in private but as declarations made in front of everyone who had believed she would live quietly and submit without question. He handed her a set of papers, proof of property placed in her name alone and legal guarantees witnessed by elders who stood stunned but silent. Tradition had been challenged publicly and there was no taking it back. Her fear did not vanish instantly, but it cracked open, allowing something unfamiliar to enter. She looked at him for the first time, fully searching his face for deception and finding none, only resolve and a quiet intensity that suggested this choice had cost him something. To the town stood frozen, unable to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the act they had just witnessed. For years power had belonged to expectation and silence, yet in this moment he had shifted it, placed it gently but firmly into her hands. The gift was not freedom taken but freedom given and recognized by all. She felt tears rise, not from fear this time but from shock and something dangerously close to relief. People whispered, some in anger, some in awe, some called it foolish, others brave, but none could deny what had been done. A line had been crossed and she was no longer invisible or powerless. She stood taller without realizing it, feeling the weight she had carried begin to lift. This moment changed everything, not because it erased the past but because it rewrote the future. In a single public act he had broken the story the town had written for her and for himself, and as she stood there surrounded by stunned faces, she realized that this marriage might not be the cage she feared but the place where her voice finally began. The days that followed did not feel loud or dramatic, yet everything had changed in quiet, powerful ways. She walked through the town no longer shrinking beneath familiar stares. People looked at her differently now, some with confusion, some with respect, some with resentment, but no one could deny that she had been given something rare and undeniable. She felt it in her posture, in her breath, in the way her feet touched the ground with certainty rather than fear. At home the space no longer felt like a place of waiting, it became a place of possibility. He did not change overnight, nor did she, but something between them softened. He spoke to her more openly, asking about her thoughts, her interests, her hopes. He listened not as an obligation but as a choice, and she slowly learned that she could answer honestly without punishment. Trust did not arrive all at once. It grew carefully, like something fragile that needed light and patience. She tested her freedom in small ways, walking alone through the market, visiting neighbors, speaking when she disagreed. Each time she returned unharmed, stronger, more certain that the gift had been real and not a performance. The town continued to whisper, but the whispers no longer shaped her identity. She had been seen, heard and publicly valued. That knowledge became armor against doubt. She began to imagine a future that belonged to her, whether it remained beside him or took a different path entirely. For the first time the choice was hers. He never reminded her of what he had given because he did not see it as generosity but as justice. She began to understand that he too had lived under expectations, never asked what he wanted, never allowed to soften. In giving her freedom he had claimed his own. Their relationship grew not from fear but from honesty, from conversations shared in quiet evenings and silences that felt safe rather than threatening. She learned that respect could be steady rather than loud, and that love did not always arrive as passion but sometimes as protection without control. She was no longer the girl who stood trembling on her wedding day believing her life had ended. She was becoming a woman who understood her worth and her voice and her power. The marriage that began without her consent did not define her ending. In the end, the gift that stunned the town did more than change one woman. It challenged a tradition built on silence. It showed that strength could look like restraint and that honor could include compassion. And as she looked toward the future, she did so without fear, knowing that whatever came next would be faced by choice, not force, and that alone changed everything.